Joined today on the Bipartisan Brief by two brothers out of Atlanta, Ty and Walker Anderson. And fellas, I know that you've been involved in the protest, and so my first question is a rather obvious one. Tell me what it is that you're seeing.
Well, so I was up in Maine when the protest started, and then I came down here around maybe June 8th, and you had already been in the streets a little bit. And so the days that I got back around the 9th or 10th of June, it had, I guess, moved away a little bit from the more riot phase in the week immediately following George Floyd's murder. So the first couple I went to were pretty peaceful and rowdy for sure, but very peaceful. And then whichever day that was that Rayshard Brooks was murdered, it was kind of a different story. It was just a different scene than I had seen. I had, having just gotten back.
The first one that I went to, the first time I went to a protest after was like 3 days after George Floyd's murder. It was the second night of protests in Atlanta. And at each one, I mean, there's been, each time I've been out there, there's been a little bit different, a little different vibe and people calling for different things. But the one truly consistent thing that I've seen every time are dynamic young Black leaders and people of all races and ages following their lead.
I want to follow up on the people of all races thing, especially during from what I've seen and what I can gather, the ratio's generally been like 95% protest, 5% riot. And some of the protests have been more disruptive than others. And so you mentioned the multiracial elements. Like, for example, you guys were there during the 75-85 blockage as a way to force the powers that be to listen. And you mentioned the multiracial dynamic. And I know that a lot of white people are reflexively afraid to join a protest, especially a protest that's on the rowdier side. And walk us through the racial dynamic of tell us what you saw of the protest in the block in 75-85 and how that went down, and walk us through the racial dynamic of walk white people through the reflexive fear. Is there a reason to be afraid if you're a random good-hearted white person who is down there with the good intentions to support the cause?
Yeah, first of all, we didn't know going out there that day. Like that day I had gone to an event where there was like 500 bike riders going through, and then there was a moment of silence driving through the streets of Atlanta. And there's just a wide spectrum of protesting going on. Like the one the day of the blockade on 75-85, we started in Centennial Olympic Park and started with a group that started marching, and we weren't even really sure exactly where they were going.
It was, it happened very organically that the group decided that they were going to go walk a few miles south to that Wendy's, to that intersection, University Avenue, where he was murdered. And once we got there, it was all just very organic how things happened. There was no like, hey, at this time we're going to block 75. It was kind of walking around that intersection that had all been blocked off. And I mean, it kind of had like a Capitol Hill autonomous zone feel to it for like a few hours. It was just people kind of walking around in different groups and just knowing that we had the street, completely blocked off for as long as we wanted. And people were chanting and giving speeches.
You had the people that, there's these leaders that are giving speeches, but also like giving tangible things to do, like saying, okay, at City Hall Wednesday, 1:00, there's a vote to add 225 new police officers. We're going to be there to protest this. There's people going around with some literature about different groups' demands. There's people that are going around registering people to vote. It's like there isn't a one unified demand or cause, but everyone is around like there needs to be noise made right now. And for me, and I think for Walker too, as a white guy in his 30s, like I'm here to listen to those people and be led by them. I'm here for that.
Tell us about as I mentioned before, there are lots of white people who feel that they're well-intentioned, who are not showing up out of racism-based fear, a reflexive fear of, well, right now black people are mad at white people, so now's not the time for me to get involved. Walk us through what you felt and what you saw on that topic.
Most of the protests I've been to in Atlanta have been, if not 50-50, then close.
Yeah.
This one, when we went to that neighborhood, it turned probably a majority black because that's a black neighborhood, and there were already people there, protesting at that spot where Rayshard Brooks was murdered. But yeah, I think generally, there's this way in which like protests are more successful to the extent that white people are comfortable with it. And that's kind of an unfortunate reality. I think what's happening right now is a lot of white people are uncomfortable, but also understand that they need to get in the streets too. And so, I mean, it's for
whatever the reason, why, like if you're asking the question, why now white people, which I certainly am, I'm asking that of myself, and why there's this critical mass the states and around the world are like, why now? And I think there's a number of factors. Nothing historically ever happens in a vacuum. So the fact that the entire world spent the last 3.5 months, quarantining and in some level of introspection and asking themselves what type of person they want to be on the other side of this when they go back out into the world, and then bam, the universe gives you an opportunity. And so if that has led.
Yeah. And I think that what I was trying to say is that it's not that the white people showing up are just the white people who are super comfortable with the movement or comfortable, being in the streets. There's a level of discomfort that I think everyone should share, especially white people. And so, you need to get acclimated to being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because, it's pretty much the least you can do.
Pete, when they started doing when it moved from, there was a blockade of an on-ramp where the police had a real presence, and I'm not even sure who or how or why the crowd moved, but we went under the underpass, the overpass, and started moving up another on-ramp, and where they didn't have as much of a presence, they couldn't keep people. And at first, I mean, look, I can tell you straight up, I was scared to go out there, and at first did not go out there.
On the interstate.
Yeah, on the interstate. But there's people that, like, there was this one young man who I've seen at a couple of different protests who starts giving on the megaphone a very clear message. Like, we want white bodies in front of black bodies, white bodies in front of black bodies. And he's saying things like, you are paying for the sins of your ancestors by protecting a black body. And I know that hits me with a confluence of emotions and thoughts, but I'm here to listen to that. And if at that time I was willing to be there, great. But I'm here to listen to that shit.
So white bodies in front of black bodies, meaning that a police or an armed motorist who's caught in a traffic jam caused by the protest are going to probably think twice or 3 times before shooting a white person versus where they might feel a black person is more expendable. Was that the thought process behind that?
I didn't have a personal conversation with them about that, but that's the feeling I got. Like 3 weeks ago, there was a. Did you tell him?
Yeah, he's gonna be done in a minute.
Okay. 3 weeks ago at the governor's mansion, that was another theme. Like, we had a line of white people that were in front of the police in their riot gear that were getting ready to move and get people out of the street. And so, yeah, that's how I process that thinking is like, we know, unless you've been asleep for the last, 20 years, for me at least, white people are less likely to experience a physical confrontation with police and with authority. So get the white people to the front of the line.
And so you mentioned earlier that initially you were afraid when the blockage of 75-85 started. And I want to clarify, who were you afraid of?
Who I was afraid of breaking the law, going out in the middle of the interstate and stopping traffic. And yeah, and
the notion that they were saying in 5 minutes, they're going to start with tear gas, and there was some skepticism about that because there were so many cars there that obviously weren't part of the protest, that they weren't going to just start gassing around these cars that we were blocking. But yeah, it was just very intense. I mean, I've never been a part of anything like that. And there was the moment where they were passing around stuff to wash your face if you get tear gassed, and telling, the white people there to get to the front. And scared, but it was exciting. It was just very, very intense, very, very intense. But I was scared of only a violent interaction with
the police.
Yeah.
And that's important to point out because, again, so many white people have this reflexive fear, and they misunderstand that this is not a movement against white people. It's against systematic race-based injustice. And so I think it's important for white people to hear from y'all that there you are down there at a very intense moment, quite possibly, depending on the results of this movement, a historic moment. And yet you never felt from the black leaders of the protest, like, what are you guys doing here? This is not like, you felt as if the protest itself was inclusive, and to the extent you were afraid of the police or of an angry armed motorist. You were not afraid of the black people leading the protest and the people generally participating in the protest. Is that correct?
Definitely. So much of what like some of those leaders are talking about when they're giving speeches or leading the protest is like talking about white silence, talking about, but a lot of it is directed at white people in the sense that white people need to change. A lot of it is directed at black people in terms of like, shared experience of pain in this society. But when in that moment when we were confronting the police, it became very clear. Okay, the white people who are here, you want to be here, you want to be an ally. Here's a very simple way to show it: get to the front. And I mean, it was just so clear cut at that moment. And
I even remember him saying, if you're scared, I understand. That's okay. You can go home. And not in like you're either with us or against us. It was like, you are like, here's, like Walker just said, here's a way right now for you to show a very physical display of support. And if that's too much and that's scary, then that's all right.
Yeah. And there was a real, like I said, a moment of excitement when we got out onto the interstate because, I mean, this protest on this day was on that intersection. It was so fresh that Rayshard Brooks had been murdered the night before. There was an anger in the crowd among everyone, white, black, everybody. And there was, like I said, going around that intersection, that crowd, us included, was looking for a confrontation, looking for a disruption. And when the idea organically came about that people started going up the hill to the interstate, it was like everyone was like, okay, this is it. Here's the moment. And it just all became very clear. I mean, we had been in that area for quite a few hours and then suddenly people started getting on the interstate, and it became what it became.
And look, just as a caveat, I don't think this necessarily needs to be said, but our scope here is very narrow. This is our experience at just these protests in one American city that we've been to. But we can't speak for, what other people are experiencing, but from what we've seen,
and we're no career activists.
Right, absolutely not. But we can say that when I've been out there, I have never felt any danger or even a lot of animosity from black protesters. The anger is, like Walker said, a collective thing, and the aggression is from law enforcement. Oh yeah.
Well, guys, that mirrors what I'm hearing. I've spoken with people who were at the first night of protests in Houston. I've spoken with people who've been to Chaz or Chop. They've changed the brand in Seattle. And what I'm hearing mirrors y'all's experience, which is that the overwhelming majority of the protests have not devolved or descended into what could be called a riot. And I want to be clear, blocking 7585, that's a disruption. That's not a destruction.
Absolutely. No. Totally nonviolent.
And I think it's important to point that out as well. And white people often will reference Dr. King as the right way to do this. And it's important to understand that Dr. King advocated disruption, constant disruption. He knew that if white people remained comfortable, that nothing would ever change. And so the history of Dr. King has been very much, you could say, whitewashed. And the reality is that he preached and advocated disruption. And so I wonder if you guys have anything else you'd like to add before we move on with the rest of our day.
No, I will say that, yeah, I think Dr. King's legacy has been whitewashed in a lot of ways, as if what he did was the right way for black people to protest and easier for white America to
more palatable for
digest.
White America.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, for one, that was 50 years ago, and this is a new time, and this is being led by a new generation. And it doesn't seem, I think I also get a lot from white people that want to discredit this movement, as with the question like, oh, what do they want? What do we want? What are the exact demands? And that is, you don't have to be, an expert in public policy to get your license to go protest. And if you are simply out there to let your voice be a part of the collective noise that is saying, hey, something's wrong. Maybe I don't know exactly what it is that needs to be fixed or how to fix it, but I hope the people that do are listening.
Well, and I want to point out that for all the people who look at the protests and say, what are the solutions? What do they want? And it's certainly in many cases a distraction, and is an excuse not to support the protest. Well, if it's not so organized to have a specific list of 10 things that they want changed, then it's for no point. It's an empty barrel making the most noise and that type of thing. And so for anybody watching, you can Google Campaign Zero as a starting point. It's a fairly comprehensive set of realistic, reasonable solutions to the issues of disproportional police misconduct and violence toward black people. And the reality is there are, like, literally, whether it's Cato Institute or, there are so many comprehensive solutions being proposed. And so rather than just dismissively say, well, what do they want? Google can be your friend here, people. Feel free to go online and check out the wide variety of solutions, and not just to correct our broken policing culture, but also whether it's banking or housing or like this. So any white people watching, please don't feel like it's an empty barrel with no solutions. There are literally hundreds of solution-based policy proposals out there. And I would respectfully suggest that it's on you to find that. The protesters are a little bit busy right now. So how about you go ahead and get online and do your part, rather than simply being what Teddy Roosevelt would have called the critic rather than the doer. So you guys are a couple of doers, and I appreciate your perspective on the standpoint of you're not trying to be a white savior. You're trying to be just an assistant, just helpful in any way that you can. And I know that you guys had trepidation about coming on. And I want to say to any white people who are involved in protests and are earnestly seeking change, yes, we need to listen to black people. We also need to speak, because the reality is that if a black person says the white people at the protest weren't afraid of us, they were afraid of the cops, that's a very complicated thing for the average white person to hear and accept and believe and trust. Whereas when it comes out of y'all's lips, it has a lot more credibility in the mind of the average white person. And if you hearken back to Dr. King as an example, he strategically placed white people underneath him and had them serve as spokespeople in certain circumstances, knowing that a white ear would hear a white voice better in some circumstances. So as long as you know your own heart and you're not trying to take this over and make it about you, don't be afraid to speak up. And I don't just mean y'all, I mean other white people who are genuine allies. So Ty, Walker, I really appreciate your time this morning, and I look forward to staying in touch and possibly doing a follow-up as this story continues to develop. So thank you so much for y'all's commitment and for y'all's time.
All right, Coach.
See you, Pete.